Today, as I said, Robert Atkinson is going to be giving us his presentation on the dark night of the collective soul. He has a PhD and is an internationally acknowledged authority on life story, interviewing, personal myth-making, and soul-making. He's published 9 different books. The Story of Our Time, From Duality to Interconnectedness to Oneness, which just came out, is a source of many of the themes for his series that we're going through right now. He has a BA in Philosophy and American Studies, 2 master's degrees, one in American folk culture and one in counseling. And of course, his PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania in cross-cultural human development. He's also been a postdoc at the University of Chicago. So with that introduction, we will now turn this over to Robert and we will hear him. And I'm looking forward to hearing his presentation.
Great. Thanks very much, Rob. It's great to be back with you for the second of 3 web talks. And this topic is actually kind of seasonal as we enter the season of the winter solstice, the darkest time of the year. The constant observable laws of nature become even more intriguing and marvelous because this season emphasizes patterns that make it all the more evident that all of creation is an indivisible oneness, even with its changes and transformations. So this talk does come mostly from my book, The Story of Our Time. And as I mentioned last week, this is a book designed to provide a missing perspective on what unifies the world's wisdom traditions by adding something new and unique on how, why, and in what direction humanity's conscious evolution is unfolding. So I want to start off with 2 big picture quotes again from Abdu'l-Baha. All things are subject to transformation and change. Creation is the expression of motion, and motion is life. Nothing is stationary in the material world of outer phenomena or in the inner world of intellect and consciousness. And this thought seems to be supported or agreed upon by Carl Jung, who said, the upheaval of our world and the upheaval in consciousness is one and the same. We are only at the threshold of a new spiritual epoch. So a very quick review. Last week, we talked about how we were living in a spiritual springtime, a time of renewal, and how spiritual epochs have clearly punctuated humanity's conscious evolution and how each of them has brought about a leap of consciousness. Today, we're going to focus on the process and pattern of transformation itself to understand better how these leaps of consciousness actually take place. So we're starting off with the idea or the principle that unity is the result of the conscious confrontation of opposing forces. Then we'll look at opposition as the catalyst for transformation. And we'll talk about the polarity principle and the necessity of adversity. And then we'll get into the dark night of the collective soul and what that means for us today. And finally, we'll consider what a world giving birth means. And then we'll have some time for reflection and dialogue. So, starting off with principle 4 from the book, The Story of Our Time, unity is the result of the conscious confrontation of opposing forces. We are built to confront and overcome difficulties and challenges. Trials and tribulations are purposive. They are a bounty of divine bestowal, meant to help us restore the dualities of life to their wholeness and facilitate the process of transformation. And this is alluded to by the Universal House of Justice in the Promise of World Peace. far from signalizing the end of civilization, the convulsive changes towards which humanity is being ever more rapidly impelled will serve to release the potentialities inherent in the station of man. And that's a really interesting concept because it implies that convulsive changes or transformation is necessary to achieve the inherent potentialities that we have within us. So opposition creates opportunity, maintains the law of balance, and is necessary for ensuring cyclical process within a linear process. Transformation is necessary for growth and evolution. Its pattern is carried out on the collective level for humanity as a whole, just as it is on the personal for the individual. So when we look at humanity's current situation, we can't help but wonder if the transformation of consciousness currently underway is linked to the radical statement, especially for the mid-1800s, the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens, at the heart of the Baha'i revelation. The circumstances we're living in right now create the conditions for growth and transformation, which will ultimately lead to humanity being able to embrace this reality. So change is happening at a perilous pace. The world is being reformed and transformed before our very eyes. As Greg Dahl has written, a relentless and accelerating tide of change has swept across the globe, transforming daily life, altering human and political relationships, but at the same time, threatening us with the disruption of established social orders and the possibility of cataclysm and extinction. So here comes the polarity principle into play here. Helping to guide this process is a dialectic involving a give and take that creates a dynamic of opposing forces that are with us every day of our lives. Life is made up of an ongoing series of conflicts and struggles meant to move us along the developmental path we are designed to move along. This means an inherent tension to life forms the core of the pattern of transformation. And this pattern of transformation can be seen in many versions and variations. Here are three that I'll talk about a little bit. Birth, death, and rebirth. Another one is separation, initiation, and return. Or another way of seeing the same process of transformation is synthesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Now these are built into traditional rites of passage, and they are found at the heart of sacred stories of the world's myths and religions. And probably the most familiar form of this is the one that comes from story and sacred stories, and we're all familiar with the beginning, middle, and end version of this pattern. But when we think of it in terms of this, of what it really is, a pattern of transformation, that story version can become beginning, muddle, and resolution. This is something I've written about in a couple of my books, and we'll talk more about. I mean, today our whole focus is really on the muddle portion of this process. But all three of these pieces together, combined and in sequence, represent the pattern of transformation as a whole. So we could also say that transformation is the nature of life, and that the nature of transformation is destruction or breaking down, followed by construction or building up. Or another way to look at it would be disintegration followed by integration. Transformation is how we access the higher levels of human consciousness and the hidden mysteries of life. The key to transformation is a quantum leap shift in consciousness, where we are able to see that things aren't simply separate or opposite, but are rather necessary parts of the same whole. This sense of wholeness, oneness, and unity is what enables their contradictions to be seen as complementary and allows for a merging of opposites and completes the act of transformation, which becomes a process of uniting the polarities. So a little bit about the necessity of adversity. Change is inevitable, but transformation is conditional upon understanding the intended meaning and purpose the transition has for us. Transformation depends upon and incorporates adversity, which creates and amplifies a necessary opposition to be resolved. So the goal of the transformation process is not the uncertainty or chaos that initially arises from the adversity. It's not the muddle that we find ourselves in oftentimes in any of our life transitions, but rather the synthesis and union of seemingly separate parts when they are recognized as a whole. This is an essential oppositional process that makes up a sacred pattern found worldwide. So far from being an accident, transformation is essential to ongoing progress in the physical world. As Abdu'l-Baha says here, change and transformation are necessities of the contingent world, but not of the essence of divinity. The law of opposition is key to understanding the process of transformation. And this is where Jung comes in again, the psychologist of the 20th century. He says, there is no balance, no system of self-regulation without opposition. Nothing so promotes the growth of consciousness as this inner confrontation of opposites. So opposition and adversity are catalysts for our own continued growth and transformation, tests coming to us from the material world to teach us how to become more attached to the spiritual realm. As Abdu'l-Baha says here, grief and sorrow do not come to us by chance. They are sent to us by the divine mercy for our own perfecting. Because this divine pattern is part of our inherent nature, we have an innate need and capacity to overcome and resolve the difficulties and adversities we encounter. And here's an interesting quote going way back to Plato, who had some insights into this process as well. Perhaps there is a pattern set up in the heavens for one who desires to see it, and having seen it, to find one in himself. So it's just a second here. It is well known from the world's spiritual, mystical, and religious literature that we all experience periods of doubt, confusion, and conflict many times over in our lives, all of which can fuel a dark night that eventually turns into a process of transformation. The journey into a dark night where all is new, unknown, and at risk is a journey toward reshaping our lives and redefining who we are. The phrase, dark night of the soul, was introduced in the 16th century by mystic St. John of the Cross, which is now a classic motif in all literature and has come to identify a time of challenge, despair, and spiritual crisis in a person's life that often leads to transformation involving a symbolic death and rebirth experience, resulting in a deeper spiritual life. But what about the dark night of the collective soul? Does this pattern of transformation hold as true on the collective level as it does on the individual level? Is humanity currently experiencing a loss of soul, a spiritual crisis? Are we in the midst of a period of confusion and chaos, leading to a symbolic death and rebirth of communities, nations, and society as a whole? We do know from history that civilizations and empires have long followed a pattern of rise and fall. Just think of the Egyptian, Aztec, Mayan, Greek, Roman, and so many other civilizations. After their fall, they've continued on and have had their own form of the process of death and rebirth. This pattern is as true in our time, only now what affects the part impacts the whole. The transformation of the part will include the transformation of the whole. When we think about the idea of the dark night of the collective soul, we really can say that global transformation will be a gradual, part-by-part process, in the long run resulting in the advancement of civilization as a whole. But there will be parts of that whole lagging behind. All of creation is part of this divine pattern of opposition followed by progress. Nothing escapes the cycle of opposites that defines the nature and process of change and growth. This can all be seen as a twofold process of universal fermentation in every continent and every sphere of life, as Shoghi Effendi describes it. It is a dual process of purging and reshaping humanity in anticipation of the day when the wholeness of the human race will have been recognized and its unity established. This collective pattern of growth is characterized by a series of pulsations of alternating crises and triumphs, forming a dialectic of victory and crisis. Again, from Shoghi Effendi. One aspect of the process is fundamentally disruptive, tending to oftentimes violently maintain the barriers that separate humanity, while the other is essentially integrative, serving to unify world systems. So ours is clearly a time of one of humanity's greatest transformations. We live in a world defined by dramatic collapse of the old forms of society. This disintegrating force has made chaos the norm for the generations of the 20th and 21st centuries. Though this social fermentation is a painful process, all of the elements that have been broken apart will gradually be reorganized and reformed into something entirely new. And now we're beginning to see that humanity's story has taken this turn toward chaos and disintegration because it refuses to embrace the spiritually based principles meant to guide its evolution into a new global era. At the same time, a vast process of renewal is underway. Our suffering is serving to purify and bring together the entire human race. The way forward may be through further pain and destruction, yet this is what will finally bring the differences into sharper focus. In fact, as the recurring crises increase and intensify all around us, it is most important to maintain a focus on the whole overarching process that is indeed unfolding. And this is where the Baha'i writings provide a big picture, long-term perspective on this process of transformation. In this quote, especially in this quote from Baha'u'llah, "The winds of despair are blowing from every direction, and the strife that divides and afflicts the human race is daily increasing. Adversities unimaginably appalling, undreamt of crises and upheavals, might well combine to engrave in the soul of an unheeding generation those truths and principles which it has disdained to recognize and follow." And the quote goes on, "Whether peace is to be reached only after unimaginable horrors precipitated by humanity's stubborn clinging to old patterns of behavior, or is to be embraced now by an act of consultative will, is the choice before all who inhabit the earth. The current world confusion and calamitous condition in human affairs is a natural phase in an organic process leading ultimately and irresistibly to the unification of the human race in a single social order whose boundaries are those of the planet." So the promise of world peace has been out there for millennia. From this quote and many others, it's clear that it is up to us now to bring it into reality. And we'll talk much more about this challenge in the third talk coming up next week. But as a glimmer of the light at the end of the dark night begins to rise above the horizon, we can keep our eyes on this coming dawn and on the signs of hope and progress we are witnessing. So we are at the end of one cycle and the beginning of another, witnessing the death of the old, which seems like it's taking a long time, but the birth of the new is clearly on its way. And as Jung noted some 80 years ago, we are only at the threshold of a new spiritual epoch. And also, as Teilhard de Chardin echoed, we are watching the birth more than the death of a world. And this is partly to kind of reassure us that the Baha'is are getting a lot of help out there with this process. And here's another systems thinker, Irvin Laszlo, actually the founder of modern systems thinking. Irvin Laszlo calls where we are right now, the tipping point, where we head toward mass extinction or toward a sustainable future. And he asked the question, can we go any further along the path to breakdown before it is too late? Or are we already far enough down the path to break through into the birth process that there is no turning back? Laszlo has a lot to say about this, and he continues by saying the eventual result of this imminent birth process will be a consciousness that recognizes our connections to each other and to the cosmos. A consciousness of connectedness and memory that conveys a sense of belonging, ultimately of oneness, a wellspring of empathy with nature and solidarity among people. And he Laszlo goes on to define planetary consciousness as the knowing as well as feeling of the vital interdependence of an essential oneness of humankind. This is put into action when an individual, again quoting Laszlo, recognizes his or her role in the evolutionary process and acts responsibly in light of this perception. Other allies and helpers who recognize this same concept would be Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said, "The atomized, homogeneous groups that existed in the past are no longer the truth of our world. We must recognize that we are part of one group, one family, the human family. Our survival as a planet depends on it. We are part of one family." So profound changes have already taken place around the world in the century and 3/4 since the revelation of Baha'u'llah, including much pain, upheaval, and suffering. At the same time, a new consciousness of oneness is laboring to be born as the core principles from that most recent divine revelation are put into action. And I just want to, I think we have time here to just as a reminder and also as an emphasis to mention those core principles of the most recent divine revelation. And we can understand these core principles of our time, that is since the mid-1800s, as that one single divine being known by hundreds of names, such as Brahman, Yahweh, God, and Allah, whose ultimate nature is unknowable, created the universe and all creatures and forces within it. That from this supreme being have flowed a continuous succession of prophets to guide humanity toward understanding reality, around whom have formed the world's religions and spiritual traditions. That all humanity is part of one human family, that with only one reality, the discoveries and findings of science must be in harmony with the principles and beliefs of revealed religion, and vice versa. That the full equality and partnership of women and men is essential to human progress. That prejudice, whether racial, ethnic, national, religious, or economic, must be overcome if humanity is to establish a just global society. That there is an essential connection between equitable economic prosperity and the spiritual principles governing life. That without preconceptions, we must acquire knowledge through our own efforts by independently investigating truth, and that the longed-for goal of world peace now the greatest need of our time is within our reach. So though we are still awaiting the final shift in consciousness to bring this understanding into full acceptance and practice, we can find motivation, hope, and renewed energy in witnessing the widespread change that has and is continuously occurring in the world. If we could see with the eye of the Creator, we would see this politically disrupted, economically paralyzed, and socially writhing world slowly breaking up, preparing the way for the birth of the new world. The evolutionary shift rate is speeding up, yet we cannot say when the birth process will finally be completed. Nor can we know for sure whether the just and equitable global society sought for by so many for so long will be achieved only after further unimaginable horrors resulting from blindly clinging to old patterns, or more quickly and smoothly by consciously embracing and acting upon the newly revealed spiritual principles of our time. So what we do know is that the choice is fully ours. And I think this quote from Baha'u'llah fits in here. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. A gradual and unfolding process of evolution guides our collective progress in taking on the responsibility required and actively carrying forward an ever-advancing civilization. The world is birthing a whole new way of seeing the world. This involves a transformation of consciousness never before witnessed. Spiritual energies already released will ensure the renewal of individuals, institutions, and civilization itself. And Baha'u'llah has assured us, the object of every revelation is to effect a transformation in the whole character of mankind, a transformation that shall manifest itself outwardly and inwardly, that shall affect both its inner life and external conditions. So this, to me, sounds like a total, complete, end-to-end, top-to-bottom, deep and thorough transformation. So beneath the illusion of separation, humanity is one family, a global community where the consciousness of oneness is emerging. This, I think, leaves us with an understanding and the tools that we need to become the midwives of this birth process that the world is undergoing currently. And it also makes it clear that the big question remaining is, what is our role in this comprehensive process going to be? So I have a couple of questions for further reflection for us to think about and maybe guide our meaningful conversation from here on. How do we understand the principle and process of transformation in relation to events and processes happening in the world now. And how do we apply this understanding to our everyday lives and carry it out in our regular, focused action in the world? Once again, as I did last week, I'll like to close with this oneness pledge, because I think this is a tool that we can use and add to our toolbox of spiritual practices. If this is taken in, integrated into our thoughts and actions on a regular basis, we will gradually be able to be in the world, live in the world, and act in the world with the eye of oneness. So this was kind of quick run through a lot of big picture principles and ideas, but I think we have some time left for discussion.
Yeah, I certainly think we have plenty of time for discussion, and I appreciate, Bob, that you gave us those two questions, which I'm still pondering. You may want to put them back up on the screen. Yeah, thanks, so that we can think about them. I much appreciated your, how should I put this, sort of psychological or mystical way of looking at the crisis that humanity is facing. And it shows the same pattern I've heard recently in other talks about the world crisis, the other talks by Baha'is, I should say. Roya Achavan, for example, gave a talk a couple of weeks ago up in Minnesota that I heard. And similarly, without talking about dark night or talking about, synthesis and thesis, antithesis, and synthesis and these things, she nevertheless found, shall we say, the silver lining in the crises that we currently face as a species, and really created a perspective of hope, which I think you've also given us today. So I really appreciate that. And let me see if we have any comments here yet. Well, one person is asking this question, which is not a response to your two questions here, and that is this: is your book available through the Baha'i distribution service?
Yes, it is. It is, and if they happen to be out right now, it is also available on Amazon.
Shahla asks, what do you mean by, quote, process of transformation has a parallel in the ritual process, unquote? Can you elaborate on, quote, how we are individually and collectively built to overcome difficulty, unquote? Are the processes of integration and disintegration going on in parallel or sequentially? Yeah,
okay, that's a great question, and I think it'd be good to take a little time to go back through that. So first of all, what I'm talking about as a process of transformation happens kind of as a mirror reflection on both the individual level and the collective level, but at various rates and under different circumstances and so on. But it is a universal process on both of those levels, individual and collective. And just to say a little bit more about the ritual process, that's another really good example of how this process of transformation occurs at both the individual and the collective level at the same time in traditional communities. So when we talk about rites of passage, we're going back to indigenous cultures and others that had a regular practice of rites of passage, whether it was wedding or birth itself. Where this process comes into play the most in that setting of indigenous communities and other traditional communities would be the what's probably known more commonly as the adolescent rite of passage, or the youth rite of passage. And though it's designed for the individual youth or child as a process to undergo, to be welcomed into the community at large by the community, it's for the individual, but the community as a whole also not only participates in it, but guides that whole process. And in the ritual process, the three phases are referred to as separation, transition, incorporation. So that's, if you're familiar with Native American rites of passage, or the Vision Quest, or any of those kinds, you understand, or you may be familiar with the child or the youth being sent out into the wilderness on his or her own, and in the wilderness, in the unknown, confronts things that were never confronted before, and has to learn what's necessary from that confrontation with the unknown. And then when that's accomplished, the child returns to the community and is welcomed as an adult. So it's both an individual process and a collective process at the same time for the child and the community, who then receive a new adult member after the individual has gone through that. I think there was a second part to that question that that I forgot right now.
Let's see. Well, she talks about the process of transformation as a parallel in the ritual process. You've covered that. How can we individually and collectively build to overcome difficulty in general? And are there processes of integration and disintegration going on in parallel or sequentially?
Well, okay, so there's two parts to that one too. Let me, the first part again was, once more, sorry.
Can you elaborate on, quote, how we are individually and collectively built to overcome difficulty?
Okay, well, that's something that I tried to point out from the writings from the Baha'i faith, how that is the case, is the way we were designed as human beings by the Creator. And I think the writings not only support that, but clarify that is the reality of things, and that the nature of transformation is something that we're all made to undergo, and that typically we're not given a challenge that we're not inherently capable of accomplishing. But another big piece to that whole process is the knowledge that it exists as a process of transformation, and so that's why I was trying to outline the parts to the process. And if we can understand the process as any of those forms that I mentioned, maybe one of the easier forms to keep in mind would be beginning, muddle, resolution. We can all think of times in our lives when we're in a muddle, when things aren't going right or the way we might want them to, and it feels not only like a crisis, but something that we may be stuck in, and we have no idea of how to get out from that muddle. But I think just knowing that, first of all, knowing what the whole is, that the muddle is the middle part of a process, and that it's designed to lead to resolution. Knowing that pattern as a whole can help us live into the resolution, whatever it's going to be. We obviously wouldn't know when we're in the midst of whatever muddle it is, but knowing that it's meant to lead to some kind of a resolution again, gives us that sense of hope and sense of purpose and meaning to that muddle that we're facing at that moment, and that it's really designed, as Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha point out, it's really designed and given to us for our own growth and transformation, and that it will eventually lead to a resolution, which completes the process of transformation, and in doing that, allows us to see things totally different than we had in relation to, or in regard to, the muddle that we were in for however long. We see that totally differently now, and we also recognize that whatever the opposing forces were that were creating that muddle for us, they are now also seen as part of a whole. And so we're able, with that resolution, we're able to take a more holistic perspective on the process itself. And I think that knowledge helps.
I think that's a great point. There's a marvelous term in ritual studies that I heard once, and that's the term liminal.
Yeah.
The idea, the term comes from the Latin liminus, which is the threshold of a door.
Right.
And, so if you want to walk from one room to the other, there's a brief period of time when you're not in either room, you're on the threshold instead. So you're in that state of transition, and that's the liminal state. And I've always thought that that's a really nice image in my mind of transition, of going from one room to the other. There's that brief period of time when you're not in either room, you're on the threshold instead. And that's the key in ritual studies, and the key in many, many human processes, is that we're at that point where we're neither fish nor fowl, we're kind of in between.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point, Rob. And I'm glad you mentioned that liminal, because that's another term that is used for that transition period, and for that, even for death, symbolic death. And of course, it's another term for the muddle that I was talking about. So we can, because it does mean, as you said, as you pointed out, it means, it refers to that in-between phase from the old to the new. And we don't just go directly from the old to the new. There has to be that liminal in-between phase or period or process and experience itself that takes us from the old through that unknown, and then eventually to the new. So yeah, the liminal phase is really key. And so one of the things that happens in this process of transformation, especially when if we ever feel like we're stuck in the muddle part of it or the liminal part of it, there may be a tendency to want to turn around and go back, or something along those lines, because things seem to be about the worst they've ever been for us, and we can't face or imagine how we're going to...
I'm tempted to say make America great again right now, but yes. That's the reaction to the liminal phase, you might say.
Right. Yeah, so we can't turn around. I mean, it's not about turning around. It's about going through that muddle, going over, taking that big step over the threshold into the new room, through the doorway into that new world. That is one of the most difficult things, and the worst thing we can think about or try to do or want to do is to turn around and go back.
Yeah,
right.
Really.
And actually, another example of that, one of my mentors way back in the late 60s, early 70s was Joseph Campbell, who I think I mentioned last time. At one of his talks it was the talk that I went to at Cooper Union. He compared the journey of the hero, or the myth of the hero, to the psychological process of schizophrenia. And on some levels, they can be compared. And the way Campbell compared it was that one of the ways the medical model wants to get us through the process or the experience of schizophrenia is turning us around and going backward. And Joseph Campbell is saying from a mythological perspective and from a spiritual, mystical perspective, that, again, is not the way to do it. We have to make our way through that most difficult phase in our lives, personally and collectively, to be able to cross that threshold, get in and enter into that new room, that new world, and build it in the process once we do cross that threshold. So yeah, it's definitely not about turning back. I mean, that just if anyone has done that, has tried to, or has actually turned back from something, one of the things you may find out and discover in doing that turnaround is that the same predicament is going to come up again, and you're going to be faced with it again and again until you make your way through that and across that liminal threshold.
Yeah, in many ways, that's the whole problem ISIS has too. They want to turn the clock back and not figure out how to deal with the new world exactly. Well, Shahla had a third question, remember, and that is the processes of integration and disintegration going on in parallel or sequentially?
I'm not quite sure what she means by in parallel to what, or...
I think, is integration and parallel going on at the same time, or is one following the other? I think is what she's asking.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. Yeah, no, it definitely is as Shoghi Effendi calls it, it's a twofold process. They're both happening at the same time. Yeah, so it's not one then the other. It is both at the same time. And so I think we can see signs of that all around us. We can see signs of the breaking down of the old, and at the same time, we can see the signs of the building up of the new happening at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's very true, but I think you could also argue there's a little bit of a sequentialness to it too, because there are certain breakdowns that may cause construction, and certain constructions that may cause breakdown. So you may have them both going on, but there's a kind of cyclical process going on within them as well, I would think.
Right. Yeah. No, that's true too. It's both. They're both happening together, and it's a sequential as well. So yeah, I mean that kind of complicates it, but it's important to recognize that all these things are going on simultaneously, and that as I'll talk more about next week, we do experience times where where it feels like we're going backwards, and that may be true for a moment or temporarily, but even that backward feeling or experience is part of the cyclical process too, because the cyclical process is both. The progression is both cyclical, which includes forward and backward at the same time, and a process of that, and it also includes the forwardness too. So this is actually next week I'll go into a lot more detail about this, where this was the thing that Irving Laszlo, again the systems theorist, the leading systems theorist, pointed out about how the revelation of Baha'u'llah was way ahead of its time, because Baha'u'llah did acknowledge that it's a process that includes progress as well as regression, and it's cyclical in nature. So we'll talk more about that next week.
Good. Do we know if Laszlo is still alive?
Yeah, he's in his 80s, and he actually lives in Italy, but he just recently, earlier this year, he had there was like a celebration of his work in St. Louis. So he was over here. I think that was put together for him to honor his work, but that was put together by Larry Dossey, who has worked with him as well.
Right.
But he's, as we'll talk more about that next week, Irving Laszlo is not only the world's leading systems theorist, he's the only one in that kind of category who has kind of understood and integrated the Baha'i teachings into his work. And we'll talk more about that, about how he's done that next week.
Right. As a non-Baha'i too, I suppose we should mention as well.
Right.
There is another question here from Paul. Well, it's actually a comment. He says, I read somewhere of an image of history as like a chain laid out. The chain extends forward, but the links in the chain are cyclical.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good good metaphor and an image of what I was just describing. The chain laid out straight looks like it's linear, but each individual chain within that chain is cyclical. So yeah, that's a great metaphor and image.
We have another question here from Paul that just popped in. The book, A Pattern Language, 1977, has as its first pattern, quote, whenever possible, work toward the evolution of independent regions in the world, each with its own natural and geographic boundaries, each one autonomous and self-governing, each with a seat in the world government. Do you see this as a paradigm which we might evolve to beyond nationhood?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one and a great question. I mean, I think that does sound like a kind of not necessarily an idealistic, but a real actually more of a practical way to understand the concept of a global commonwealth. So yeah, I mean, I think when we get to that point in our conscious evolution of being ready for a global commonwealth, it will include that kind of those kinds of regional entities. Yeah.
Yeah, we have the African Union, the European Union, Mercosur in South America, and there's something that's similar but not as well organized in East Asia, it seems to me. And so there are some regional patterns developing. You even have the Organization of Arab States, it seems to me. I'm not quite sure what it's called. So there are various organizations that do sort of model this kind of approach to regionalism as a way of going towards internationalism.
Right. So that's a really interesting piece to this whole process of transformation, in that the transformation itself as a whole is leading us all not only to the recognition and the application and the implementation of the principle of the oneness of humanity, it's also at the same time taking us to a place where we will be able to go have regional entities beyond nations that take in, as you indicated, those larger regions, and at the same time, those will become part of the global commonwealth. So yeah, it's interesting to see how there can be another step added to the whole process between nations and what a lot of people think of as a global community. There will be another step in between those two as well, it seems like.
So it's to sort of recap some of your metaphors, shall we say: the dark night of the collective soul, the liminal state, the I guess that's the antithesis level. There are various metaphors you used for this three-step process humanity is going through, with us basically being stuck in that middle muddle step right now.
Yeah, well, we're there, but at the same time, we definitely see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think it is a good metaphor to add or to think about as well, of the birth canal. I mean, there is that gives us the image of first of all, a process that once it starts can't be stopped. I mean, it's another one of those things you can't turn around and go back from.
Yeah.
So it's a process that's well underway, and I think we would agree beyond the turning back point. And it's a process that will that we are witnessing many signs of the principles of our age coming into. I mean, not only having been released as spiritual energies into the world a century and 3/4 ago, but now becoming more noticeable and recognizable in so many aspects of life in the world. And this is another piece that we'll talk a little bit about next week as well, how and who is recognizing and wanting to put into action these principles. So that, and the more that happens, the closer we get to the end of that birth canal.
Well, I don't see any other questions at the moment, and we've had a fairly good discussion, I think. The presentation was a little shorter, so the question and answer session went its usual length, and we've sort of reached the end.